Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind carried dust and judgment in equal measure the day Gilly Odell was left at the altar. The church bell had barely finished its second ring when Clyde Merritt, her fiancé of 6 months, turned from the altar, sneered openly at the left side of her face, and said loud enough for every soul inside to hear, "I cannot marry a woman with something like that on her skin." That was a dark, wine-colored birthmark curling from just beneath Gilly's left eye to the corner of her jaw. She had been born with it, lived 21 years with it, and grown used to the stares. But nothing prepared her for being humiliated in front of her kin, the preacher, and a full congregation in a small town where people had long memories. Clyde dropped her hand like it burned. Gilly stood still and silent, chin high, veil slipping off as he stormed past her and out the chapel doors. Her throat ached from holding back the tears, but she gave no one the satisfaction, not her mother, already whispering to her sister about what a shame it was, nor the girls she sewed with at the mercantile, gawking from the back pew. She turned and walked out alone. 2 weeks later, Gilly's world had shrunk to the kitchen in her father's house, a patch of raw land behind it, and the barn where she fed the chickens in silence. Her father was long gone, killed in the war, and her mother had nothing but sour looks and muttered prayers for a daughter who had scandalized the family. That morning, Gilly hitched their mule to the wagon and headed into town by herself. She needed flour, and truth be told, she needed a way to breathe again. The general store door creaked open and she stepped inside, shoulders squared, head held high. She felt the looks again, the same ones she'd known since she was 5, but she'd learned how to move past them. What she did not expect was the tall man at the counter, leaning one arm on it while he waited. He turned when the bell over the door rang. He was not from around here. The dust on his boots said he'd been riding long. The sun had colored his skin deep, and his jaw was marked with a faint scar just at the edge of his stubble. His eyes were warm, steady, and the color of river mud after a storm. They locked eyes. He looked straight at her, and not once did his gaze shift to the mark on her face. Instead, he smiled, easy and kind. "Morning," she hesitated, unsure how to respond to someone who did not flinch. "Morning," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He nodded toward the counter. "Go ahead." "I'm not in a rush." She stepped beside him to place her order, and as she did, the shopkeeper Mr. Lerman glanced at her, then at the man, and said, "Miss Odell, this here's Orin Sutton, just rode in from Montana, looking for work." Orin tipped his hat. "Pleasure, ma'am," she offered a small nod. "Gilly?" His smile widened, not mockingly, just genuine. "Gilly," he repeated. "Pretty name." She blinked. No one had ever said it like that before. Mr. Lerman handed her the flour and sugar she'd come for, and she paid with what little coin she had left from her sewing. Outside, the sun beat down hard. Gilly loaded the sack onto the wagon and was just about to climb up when a voice called out from behind her. "Need a hand?" She turned to find Orin standing there, one hand on the wagon rail. "I can manage," she said, though her arms ached from the lifting. "I believe you," he said. "Still, I would not feel right watching you do it alone." He climbed up beside her, and they rode in silence for the first few minutes until he said, "I was not eavesdropping or anything, but I heard what that man said at the church." She stiffened. "Everyone did." "I just want to say," he paused, then looked at her directly, "if a man can look at you and not see the strength it takes to walk through a town like this with your head high, he is a fool." She stared at him. "You do not have to answer that," he added, eyes forward. She smiled a little. "You are not like the men around here." "No, ma'am, I am not." They reached her house, and she thanked him as he helped her down. He tipped his hat again and said, "If you ever need a hand with the farm, I know my way around a fence and a plow." She looked at him long. "Why would you offer that?" He glanced at the birthmark on her cheek, not with pity, just with calm. "Because I would like to see you smile again. And because I think the place you were hurt most is exactly where I'd kiss you first." Her breath caught. He touched his brim, then walked back down the road. That night, Gilly stood at the window, watching the horizon where he had disappeared. She touched her cheek, right where the birthmark lay. She did not know what to make of Orin Sutton. But for the first time since the church doors slammed shut, she felt something like hope stir in her chest. Not because he had pitied her, he hadn't, but because he had looked at her like she was worth something. And that was a beginning she never thought she would get. 3 mornings after Orin Sutton helped Gilly Odell lift a sack of flour into her wagon, he showed up at her gate with his hat in hand and a borrowed spade slung over his shoulder. The sun hadn't yet burned off the low clouds drifting across the foothills, and a mist clung to the dirt path like breath held too long. Gilly had been in the garden already, sleeves rolled to her elbows, coaxing stubborn roots from the dry earth behind the house. She didn't turn when she heard the gate creak, only wiped her palms on her apron and said without looking up, "You're early." That a complaint? His voice was quiet but sure. She stood, brushing grit from her hands. "No," he nodded once and stepped inside the fence. "You said once this patch of land's too much for one person come spring. Figured I'd get a start before the ground sets up too hard." "I don't recall agreeing to that." "You didn't." He dug the spade into the earth like he'd been doing it all his life. "But I figured you've had enough of people waiting for permission to do right." She didn't smile, but she didn't stop him either. They worked without much talk. Birds nested in the cottonwoods beyond the field, and a hawk circled far off, its cry thin and sharp. Orin dug, steady and even, while Gilly hauled stones from the edge of the plot and piled them under the willow. By the time the sun rose higher, the corner nearest the barn had been cleared and turned. She poured water from the well bucket into a tin dipper and passed it to him. He drank, then handed it back. "You always do it all yourself. No one else around to do it. You ever think of leaving?" She leaned against the post, dipping her fingers into the bucket's cool rim. "Where would I go? Folks don't forget quick, not out here." He waited a beat. "I don't think you're meant to run, just didn't know if the thought had ever crossed your mind." "Once," she said. "After my father passed, I thought about Denver, but I don't have kin there or money enough to start new." He rested a hand on the spade handle. "I've been to Denver, it's loud. Smells like coal and wet stone, can't see the stars proper." She looked up at the pale sky. "I like the stars," he smiled faintly. "I figured." A quiet settled between them, not uncomfortable, just still. By midday, Gilly brought out a heel of bread and dried apples. They sat on the porch steps, hands dusted with soil and forearms sun-browned from the morning. She tore the bread in half. "Where were you before Montana?" she asked. "Texas. Before that, Arkansas. I worked cattle mostly, broke horses when I had to, took odd work when it came." She nodded. "You move a lot." "Not lately." She didn't answer that, but something shifted in how she sat, less guarded, more settled. He finished his bread, then asked, "You sew for the mercantile?" "Used to," she said. "Not much call for it now." He watched her a moment. "You good at it?" "I'm careful with my stitches." "That's a kind way of saying yes." She glanced at him. "You always talk that way, only when I mean it." She stood, brushing crumbs from her lap. "I've got beans on the stove. You want to stay?" He rose, slow and measured. "If it's not trouble." "You just turned half an acre for me," she said. "I think you've earned a bowl." As they stepped inside, Orin ducked slightly beneath the lintel, then paused. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at the small shelf nailed to the wall beside the door. A wooden horse sat there, carved rough but careful. Its legs were unbalanced, one ear chipped. He pointed. "Yours? My father made it," she said. "When I was little." He nodded, eyes resting on it a moment. "It's got character." She stirred the beans, the scent of salt pork rising. He sat at the table, hands folded. Neither said much while they ate. But when she handed him a second helping, their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. Afterward, he stood to go. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "I didn't say you could." "You didn't say I couldn't." She watched him walk the path down to the road. When he reached the gate, he turned. "You ever want to leave?" he said. "I'd ride with you." She didn't answer. Just stood in the doorway, arms folded, the wind tugging at the edge of her apron. That night she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling while the wind shifted through the cottonwoods outside. She thought of his hands in the earth, his eyes on the wooden horse, the way he'd waited before speaking. It had been a long time since anyone had waited for her to answer. The third time Orin came, he brought seed potatoes wrapped in burlap and a coil of fencing wire slung over his shoulder. He didn't knock. He never had. Gilly was in the barn, sorting through the last of the winter hay, when she heard the mule huff and shift its weight out front. She stepped into the light, wiping her palms on her skirt, and found him standing near the gate, casting a long shadow across the packed dirt. "You're not much for waiting to be invited," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Orin set the sack on the ground with care. "You looked like someone who might need something to plant." She crossed her arms, the sun warm on her back. "What made you think I hadn't already?" He met her eyes. "Because I haven't seen you walk to the south side of the plot. Ground's still too hard there. And the tools in your shed haven't been moved since I hung them." She felt her jaw tighten, not from anger but something else, surprise maybe, that he noticed such things. No one else ever had. "They're good potatoes," he added. She stepped forward, crouched beside the sack and loosened the knot. The potatoes were firm, still damp with the scent of earth. She looked up at him. "I won't stop you from digging." He nodded once and picked up the spade, not waiting for more. They worked in tandem, the rhythm easier now. The fence line by the creek needed mending, so once the rows were turned, he moved down there with the wire while she planted. The air smelled of damp soil and something faintly sweet, early chokecherry blossoms, maybe, blooming beyond the ridge. When the sun dipped low enough to throw gold across the trees, she called down to him. "Supper's ready." He set the pliers on a post and came up the hill, boots dragging just a little from the day's work. She'd set a pot of barley and carrots to simmer on the stove, with a strip of smoked venison added in. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, ducking his head slightly like he always did, even though the frame wasn't low enough to require it. They ate at the table, the quiet between them no longer unfamiliar, just comfortable. She set her spoon down and said, "You're not planning to stay in town, are you?" He chewed slowly, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "No, so what are you planning?" He rested his elbows on the table. "I was hoping to find work worth staying for." Her gaze held his. "And I think I found it." She leaned back slightly, heart thudding once hard. "Farming's not easy. Barely turns a profit." "I've never chased profit," he said. "I've chased quiet, honest work. A place where the days end with something made better than they started." She studied him, his hands roughened from years in the saddle, his shoulders broad under the faded shirt, the small scar that curved near his temple like it had been earned honestly. He looked like a man who didn't need anything from her, but maybe he wanted something. "You said you'd ride with me if I wanted to leave." "I did." She tilted her head, the light from the stove catching the curve of her cheek. "Would you stay if I asked instead?" He didn't answer right away. Just reached across the table, slow and steady, and let his fingers rest gently over hers. "Yes," he said. "If you asked, I'd stay." Her throat tightened. She didn't pull away, he didn't try to kiss her. Not yet. He only held her hand like it was something worth keeping still for. Later, as he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. The sun had dipped below the pines and the sky burned faint orange across the horizon. He paused on the step, then turned to her. "You ever wonder what comes next, Gilly?" She nodded once. "Only all the time." He looked at her then, not just her face, but her, the whole of her. And for the first time she let herself be seen without bracing for what would follow. He touched her cheek, just beside the mark, his fingers rough but warm. "I still mean what I said that day," he murmured. She breathed in, the air cool against her lips. "I know." And then he leaned in, slow enough for her to move if she wanted to. She didn't. His lips brushed the place where the birthmark met her jaw, soft like a promise. When he stepped back, she didn't look away. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. She nodded. "I'll have coffee on." He walked down the path without hurrying, the sound of his boots fading into the hush of evening. She stood there until the stars blinked into view one by one, and the night settled over the hills like a quilt pulled gentle across the land. Rain came on a Thursday, soft and steady, soaking the ridge and darkening the planks of Gilly's porch. The fields drank it down with quiet gratitude. She stood at the window with her arms folded, watching the furrows fill and the willow branches shift under the weight of water. The house smelled of yeast and wood smoke she'd baked that morning to keep her hands busy. Orin arrived on foot just past midday, oilskins slung over one shoulder, hair wet and curling at the ends. He didn't knock, just stepped onto the porch and waited, his boots dripping on the boards. She opened the door with a towel in hand. "You're soaked." "Fence can wait," he said. "But I figured you might want company." "You figured right," she said, stepping back to let him in. He peeled off the coat and hung it near the stove while she poured him a mug of chicory. He took it without a word, his fingers warming around the tin. They sat at the table, the sound of rain threading through the silence. "I found something yesterday," she said, reaching into the drawer near the hearth. She pulled out a folded scrap of muslin, the corners yellowed from years tucked away. "It was in my father's chest." Orin set his cup down. "What is it?" She unfolded it carefully, laying it flat between them. A map hand-drawn in charcoal and ink, the lines faint but still legible. The land stretched east to the river bend, marked with notations in her father's steady hand. "He wanted to build out here," she said. "Said the soil near the creek would be good for corn, never got the chance." He traced a finger along the edge. "This whole stretch yours," was his, "now it's mine, though I've never done more than scratch at the land," he nodded. "We could try." "One row at a time." She watched him examine the map, the crease between his brows deepening as he read. "You ever plant corn?" "I've helped," he said, "but I've never done it start to finish." "You want to?" He looked up at her. "If it's with you, yes." She folded the map again, slower this time. "You mean to stay through the summer then?" "I mean to stay until you ask me not to." The fire gave a soft pop and she leaned back, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. Her eyes didn't leave his. "You ever been married, Orin?" "No." "Why not?" "Didn't meet anyone I could picture sitting across from like this." She nodded slowly. "You ever think about what that life would look like?" He glanced out the window where the rain softened the edges of the world. "Sometimes. It looks like a porch with two chairs, a field with rows straight and tended, a kitchen that smells like bread, a woman who knows her own mind." She stood and walked to the stove, lifting the kettle to pour more water into both their mugs. Her hands were steady, but her voice turned quiet. "You make it sound simple." "I think the best things are." He accepted the second mug, the steam curling between them. "You'd really stay," she said, not as a question. He answered anyway. "Yes." She stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing his boot. Her voice was barely above the rain. "I don't want to be looked at like something to be pitied." He met her gaze. "I never have." She reached up, fingers grazing the edge of his jaw, tracing the line of the scar near his temple. "You've been hurt." "So have you." She let her hand fall, but not far. It came to rest over his, warm and firm. "I don't want to be alone in this house anymore." "You won't be." He stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly against the floorboards. She tilted her chin, not flinching when he reached for her. This time when he kissed her, it wasn't careful. It was certain. He held her like a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed, but also knew when silence had said all it could. When they parted, she didn't pull away. She stayed close, her head against his shoulder, the rain still falling steady beyond the walls. "You scared?" he asked, voice low. She shook her head against his chest. "Not anymore." He rested his cheek atop her hair and closed his eyes. Outside, the creek swelled, the land drank deep, and the wind shifted just enough to carry the scent of turned soil and bread cooling on the sill. Inside, two people stood still in a house no longer quiet. By late May, the corn was up to Gilly's ankles, the shoots a pale green against the dark soil. The ground had taken to the seed better than she expected, and each morning she walked the rows barefoot, her hem lifted just enough to keep from getting soaked. The air had turned warm but not yet heavy, and the creek behind the barn ran full. Orin had moved into the loft above the livery shed 2 weeks back. He'd brought only what fit in a bedroll and saddlebag, and he'd asked her permission before laying the first plank for a floor. She'd nodded once, then brought him a blanket from the linen chest her father built. Nothing more had been said, but each evening he took supper with her at the table, and each morning she found something mended or built anew: the porch rail, the broken pump handle, the gate hinge that used to catch and squeal. One dusk, while she scrubbed the kettle clean with ashes and salt, Orin rested a hand on the doorframe, watching her in the soft light. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'd like to take you into town." She paused, fingers wet, heart still. "What for?" "There's a man I knew from Sweetwater. He's selling his milk cow. I figure we're due for something fresh." Gilly dried her hands on her apron. "You want to buy a cow together?" "I want to build a life with you, Gilly. That starts with butter and ends with winter stores." She turned to face him, the last of the sun catching the frame of his shoulders. "You mean to stay through winter now?" "I mean to stay for good." Her breath caught, but only for a moment. "All right." They left at first light. Orin drove the wagon while she sat beside him, a basket of eggs and a small jar of coin tucked under the seat. The trail was soft from recent rain, and the mule's hooves left deep prints through the low pass. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp sage, and the hills rolled out like folded fabric ahead of them. The man with the cow met them behind the blacksmith shop. The animal was a broad, amber-coated Jersey with calm eyes. Gilly watched her move and asked the right questions: how she calved, whether she spooked, how much she gave, and how steady she stood. Orin said nothing, just listened and let her lead. Once the deal was struck, they walked the cow home on foot, taking the long way along the creek trail. Gilly held the rope loosely, and Orin carried the basket of eggs they hadn't traded. The cow plodded behind them, patient as a cloud. Near the bend in the creek, Gilly reached for Orin's hand. He took it without hesitation. They walked like that for a long time, the sun warm on their backs, the water babbling beside them. "Have you thought about it?" she asked, eyes ahead. "About what? What comes next? Beyond planting and cows?" He looked at her, serious now. "I have. I thought about asking you something, but I didn't want to do it too soon." She stopped walking, and the cow stopped with them. Orin turned to face her fully. "I don't need a preacher to know what I want," he said. "But if a paper and a ring matter to you, they don't," she said, stepping closer. "Not more than this does." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden ring. The grain ran smooth, the surface sanded soft. He held it out. "I made this from the oak near the stream. The one with the split trunk you said reminded you of your father's old boots." She took it slowly, eyes not leaving his. "You whittled this?" "Every night after you went to bed." She slipped it onto her finger. It fit. "I'll marry you, Orin Sutton," she said, voice steady. "If it's a quiet thing, just us and the land and God." He stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her waist, and kissed her beneath the cottonwood where the cow stood chewing grass. They were married a week later, under the willow tree behind the house. No guests, no preacher, just a single line spoken by each of them, and the placing of hands over hearts. Afterward, Gilly spread a tablecloth on the porch rail, and they shared bread she'd baked that morning with wild honey Orin fetched from a hive near the ridge. That night, they lay together in the room where her father's things had long been cleared away. The window was open to the breeze, and the stars blinked slow and quiet above them. Orin ran his fingers along her spine, then rested his palm over the curve of her hip. "You afraid?" he whispered. She shook her head against his chest. "I'm home." Years passed. The corn grew tall each season. The cow calved twice. Orin built a new barn with lumber he hewed himself, and Gilly stitched every curtain in the house from muslin dyed with onion skins and indigo. They never left the land. In time, a cradle stood near the hearth. Their daughter had Orin's eyes and Gilly's quiet strength. She grew up barefoot in the rows, learning the weight of seed and the rhythm of sun. When neighbors passed through, they'd stop at the Odell place not just for eggs or milk, but for the way the porch always smelled like bread. and for the sight of Orin and Gilly sitting side by side on the bench he'd built, watching the fields together as the light softened. They never spoke of the past. They didn't need to. They had built something lasting row by row, hand in hand, and it held, and it was enough. It was everything.